accompanied by perception of the state that is neither perception nor non-perception. At that time there is contact, there is non-wavering. These states are good. Having done, having accumulated that same good action characteristic of the formless plane, he, having wholly passed the state of nothingness, by the abandoning of pleasure, RP, attains and dwells in resultant fourth jhana accompanied by perception of the state that is neither perception nor non-perception. At that time there is two constituent jhana equanimity, one-pointedness of consciousness. This is called fourth jhana. The remaining states associated with the jhana. P equals CDHS. Para. Supramundane resultants. The four jhanas are first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. Therein what is first jhana? Herein at the time when a bhikkhu develops supramundane jhana tending to release, dispersive of continuing rebirth and death. He, for the abandoning of wrong view, for the entering of the first stage, aloof from sense pleasures, RP attains and dwells in the first jhana that is hard practice and knowledge slowly acquired. At that time there is contact, there is non-wavering. These states are good. Having done, having developed that same good supramundane jhana, he, aloof from sense pleasures, attains and dwells in resultant first jhana that is hard practice, knowledge slowly acquired and is empty. At that time there is five constituent jhana: initial application, sustained application, zest, pleasure, one-pointedness of consciousness. This is called first jhana. The remaining states associated with the jhana. P. CDHS. Para. Therein what is second jhana? Herein at the time when a bhikkhu develops supramundane jhana tending to release, dispersive of continuing rebirth and death. He, for the abandoning of wrong view, for the entering of the first stage, inhibiting initial application and sustained application, attains and dwells in the second jhana that is hard practice and knowledge slowly acquired. At that time there is contact, there is non-wavering. These states are good. Having done, having developed that same good supramundane jhana, he, inhibiting initial application and sustained application, resultant second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, first jhana, attains and dwells in the fifth jhana that is hard practice, knowledge slowly acquired and is empty. At that time there is two constituent jhana equanimity, one-pointedness of consciousness. This is called fifth jhana. The remaining states associated with the jhana. P equals CDHS. Para. Complete each in general form of first jhana, para, but with appropriate modifications. Inoperative states characteristic of the plane of form and the formless plane. The four jhanas are first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. Therein what is first jhana? Herein at the time when a bhikkhu develops jhana characteristic of the plane of form. That is inoperative, is neither good nor bad nor the resultant of action, pleasant living in the present existence, he, aloof from sense pleasures, attains and dwells in earth device first jhana. At that time there is five constituent jhana: initial application, sustained application, zest, pleasure, one-pointedness of consciousness. This is called first jhana. The remaining states associated with the jhana. Therein what is second jhana? Herein at the time when a bhikkhu develops jhana characteristic of the plane of form. That is inoperative, is neither good nor bad nor the resultant of action, pleasant living in the present existence, he, inhibiting initial application and sustained application, second jhana. P. Third jhana. Fourth jhana. First jhana, attains and dwells in earth device fifth jhana. At that time there is two constituent jhana equanimity, one-pointedness of consciousness. This is called fifth jhana. The remaining states associated with the jhana. P equals. Complete each in general form of first jhana, para, but with appropriate modifications. Herein at the time when a bhikkhu develops jhana characteristic of the formless plane. That is inoperative, is neither good nor bad nor the resultant of action, pleasant living in the present existence, he, having wholly passed the state of nothingness, by the abandoning of pleasure, P attains and dwells in the fourth jhana that is accompanied by perception of the state that is neither perception nor non-perception. At that time there is two constituent jhana equanimity, one-pointedness of consciousness. This is called fourth jhana. The remaining states associated with the jhana. Analysis according to Abhidarma. Interrogation. The four jhanas. Herein a bhikkhu aloof from sense pleasures, aloof from bad states, attains and dwells in the first jhana accompanied by initial application, accompanied by sustained application, with zest and pleasure born of detachment, inhibiting initial application and sustained application. He attains and dwells in the second jhana with internal refinement, exalted development of mind, without initial application, without sustained application, with zest and pleasure born of concentration. Desireless of zest he dwells equable, mindful, aware, and he experiences pleasure by way of mental states. This the noble ones declare, the equable mindful dweller in pleasure. He attains and dwells in the third jhana, by the abandoning of pleasure and by the abandoning of pain. Then first terminating mental pleasure and mental pain he attains and dwells in the fourth jhana neither pain nor pleasure purity of mindfulness caused by equanimity. P equals these CPs are not shown in P. T. S. Romanized text. Of the four jhanas how many are good? How many bad? How many neither good nor bad? How many with cause of bewailing? How many without cause of bewailing? P equals remaining appropriate triplets and couplets. The triplets sometimes are good, sometimes are neither good nor bad. Three jhanas are associated with pleasant feeling, except for the pleasant feeling arisen therein. The fourth jhana is associated with neither painful nor pleasant feeling, except for the neither painful nor pleasant feeling arisen therein. Four jhanas sometimes are resultants, sometimes are productive of resultants, sometimes are neither resultants nor productive of resultants, sometimes are grasped, are objects of the attachments, sometimes are not grasped, are objects of the attachments, sometimes are not grasped, are not objects of the attachments, sometimes are not corrupt, are objects of the corruptions, sometimes are not corrupt, are not objects of the corruptions. The first jhana is accompanied by initial application, accompanied by sustained application except for the initial application and sustained application arisen therein. Three jhanas are without initial application, without sustained application. Two jhanas are accompanied by zest except for the zest arisen therein. Three jhanas are accompanied by pleasure except for the pleasure arisen therein. The fourth jhana is accompanied by equanimity except for the equanimity arisen therein. Are not to be abandoned either by the first path or by the subsequent paths. Have no roots to be abandoned either by the first path or by the subsequent paths. Sometimes are cumulative, sometimes are dispersive, sometimes are neither cumulative nor dispersive, sometimes are of the seven supramundane stages, sometimes are of the final supramundane stage, sometimes are neither of the seven supramundane stages nor of the final supramundane stage, sometimes are sublime, sometimes are immeasurable. Three jhanas should not be said to have low objects or sublime objects. Sometimes have immeasurable object. Sometimes should not be said to have immeasurable object. The fourth jhana sometimes has low object, sometimes has sublime object, sometimes has immeasurable object. Sometimes should not be said to have either low object, sublime object or immeasurable object. Sometimes are intermediate, sometimes are superior, sometimes are right fixed, sometimes are of no fixed. Three jhanas do not have path as their object, sometimes have path as their cause, Sometimes have path as their dominating factor. Sometimes should not be said to have path as their cause or path as their dominating factor. The fourth jhana sometimes has path as its object. Sometimes has path as its cause. Sometimes has path as its dominating factor. Sometimes should not be said to have either path as its object, path as its cause or path as its dominating factor. Sometimes are risen. Sometimes are not risen. Sometimes are bound to arise. Sometimes are past. Sometimes are future. Sometimes are present. Three jhanas should not be said to have either past objects, future objects or present objects. The fourth jhana sometimes has past object. Sometimes has future object. Sometimes has present object. Sometimes should not be said to have either past object, future object or present object. Sometimes are internal. Sometimes are external. Sometimes are both internal and external. Three jhanas have external objects. The fourth jhana sometimes has internal object. Sometimes has external object. Sometimes has both internal and external object. Sometimes should not be said to have either internal object, external object or both internal and external object. Are not visible, are not impingent. The couplets. Are not roots. Are accompanied by roots. Are associated with roots. Should not be said to be roots also accompanied by roots. Are accompanied by roots but are not roots. Should not be said to be roots also associated with roots. Are associated with roots but are not roots. Are not roots, are accompanied by roots. Are with cause. Are conditioned. Are not visible. Are not impingent. Are not material. Sometimes are mundane. Sometimes are supramundane. Are cognizable by one way. Are not cognizable by another way. Are not defilements. Sometimes are objects of the defilements. Sometimes are not objects of the defilements. Are not associated with the defilements. Should not be said to be defilements also objects of the defilements. Sometimes are objects of the defilements but are not defilements. Sometimes should not be said to be objects of the defilements but are not defilements. Should not be said to be defilements also associated with the defilements or associated with the defilements but are not defilements. Sometimes are not associated with the defilements, are objects of the defilements. Sometimes are not associated with the defilements, are not objects of the defilements. Are not fetters. P. Are not ties. P are not floods. P are not bonds. Are not hindrances. Are not perversions. P have objects. Are not consciousness. Are mental concomitants. Are associated with consciousness. Are conjoined with consciousness. Are generated by consciousness. Are coexistent with consciousness. Accompany consciousness. Are conjoined with, generated by consciousness. Are conjoined with, generated by, coexistent with consciousness. Are conjoined with, generated by, accompany consciousness. Are external. Are not derived. Sometimes are grasped. Sometimes are not grasped. P equals complete as for defilements in previous para. Are not attachments. Are not corruptions. P are not to be abandoned by the first path. Are not to be abandoned by the subsequent paths. Have no roots to be abandoned by the first path. Have no roots to be abandoned by the subsequent paths. The first jhana is accompanied by initial application except for the initial application arisen therein. Three jhanas are without initial application. The first jhana is accompanied by sustained application except for the sustained application arisen therein. Three jhanas are without sustained application. Two jhanas are with zest except for the zest arisen therein. Two jhanas are without zest. Two jhanas are accompanied by zest except for the zest arisen therein. Two jhanas are not accompanied by zest. Three jhanas are accompanied by pleasure except for the pleasure arisen therein. The fourth jhana is not accompanied by pleasure. The fourth jhana is accompanied by equanimity except for the equanimity arisen therein. Three jhanas are not accompanied by equanimity. Are not characteristic of the plane of desire. Sometimes are characteristic of the plane of form. Sometimes are not characteristic of the plane of form. Three jhanas are not characteristic of the formless plane. The fourth jhana sometimes is characteristic of the formless plane. Sometimes is not characteristic of the formless plane. Sometimes are included. Sometimes are not included. Sometimes tend to release. Sometimes do not tend to release. Sometimes are of fixed. Sometimes are of no fixed. Sometimes are surpassable, sometimes are not surpassable. Are without cause of bewailing. P equals complete as for defilements in earlier para. Interrogation. Is ended.